Around a year and a half ago, I dove quite literally headfirst into resin 3D printing. For a while, I sort of just watched on the sidelines as many people that I knew, friends and just other people, went from FDM printing to resin printing, but I was sort of hesitant at first, and that was for quite a few different reasons. The first reason was that I just didn't see the application for my projects. Now, outside of the awesome prints that I do on my channel, most of the printing that I do for myself is actually functional. So whether it's organizational or repairing something or using it towards a project, I just wasn't really sure how I was going to be able to implement resin into that space or into that use case. Another issue for me was post-processing. From what I saw, it just looked like a nightmare. And with FDM printing as is, I always try to make it where when the part comes off the bed, it's as close to finished as possible. When it comes to sanding and priming and painting, I'm typically just not a very patient person. And so it just seemed like a headache to have every single print come off of the printer, go into a resin bath, and then be blasted with UV light. And so that was another reason why I kind of held off as long as I did. Also, odors was a big issue for me. I know that I had heard and seen a lot about resins being kind of nasty, and being that I've been in an apartment for the last 3 years, having a designated space for my resin printers just wasn't an option. So I was certainly worried about my health and my fiance's health and the health of my animals. And so the idea of fuming up my place with resin was not attractive to me. On top of that, the price of resin printing when you go back about a year and a half or 2 years ago was much, much higher than what I was spending on a typical spool of like PLA or PTG for my FDM printers. The last reason why I held off as long as I did was the software. The software for resin printing was seriously in its infancy when you compare it to the awesome free slicers that we have available for FDM printing. I mean, if you look at a lot of the things that were available back in 2018 and earlier, it was incredibly bare bones. So at the time I finally decided to give it a go, which again was about a year and a half ago, I had found some projects that I was really excited to be able to use the technology with, and I had become much more familiar with the technology just due to friends owning the machines, content and articles that I read online. There was a lot more data out there that made this technology a bit less intimidating to tap into or to step into. And although most of those things I just mentioned a moment ago are still certainly valid, a lot of my thinking has shifted on it now that I've come over to the other side and I've been resin printing for a year and a half. And resin printing really seems to be going the way of FDM printing, where if you look back 6 years ago to where when I got into it and where it's at today, it has evolved substantially. And over the last year and a half to 2 years, I've seen resin printing doing the exact same thing, and it is incredibly exciting. I figured it'd be really useful to make a video where I talk about some of the things that I've learned and how my views have changed since now resin printing, because I know that if I had those initial concerns, there's got to be other people out there that are also having similar worries, and perhaps by watching this will give you a better idea and kind of put your mind at rest for a lot of those initial concerns that you may be having. Aside from that, in this video, we're going to talk about the most used accessories that I have in my workflow while resin 3D printing, as well as some just basic or random, I guess, tips and tricks that I have learned that I think may be useful for you. This is definitely targeted more towards someone that's looking to get into resin 3D printing or someone that's just beginning off on their journey versus a seasoned veteran, but there still could be things in here that you might find informational, or you might have some things to contribute as well. So without further ado, I hope you guys are excited. Let's get right into the video. So starting right off, let's get right into my first reason, which was lack of application. So resin 3D printing is awesome. If you are a 3D modeler, if you want some stuff for tabletop D&D gaming or miniatures, it is fantastic. The models that you can create with it are absolutely insane. So with that being said, what's changed? Well, as I've gotten more familiar with the technology, I have figured out ways where I can incorporate it with my FDM printers and into some of my projects. I now have a better understanding of the capabilities and the limitations of the technology. And so maybe I don't use resin printing for my entire application or my functional part, but I can use FDM printing to knock out a big portion of it and then use the resin prints to produce any fine details that might be needed for the part. Also, in the last year and a half, resins have really evolved. When I first got into resin 3D printing, there wasn't a whole lot of different types of resins, at least not in the hobbyist realm. When you get into the more industrial stuff, sure, there's medical grade and surgical grade and dental grade and all that different stuff, but just in terms of the properties, most of the resins that were available were just kind of standard resins that were fairly brittle. And as time has progressed, we now have a much broader range of resins available. We've got ABS-like resins, we've got tougher resins, we've got high temperature resins, we've got flexible resins, we've got variations of resins, and there's even people now that are starting to blend some of these resins together to get certain unique properties, which because of that allows you to have a much more diverse application when resin 3D printing and what projects you can and can't use it for. And the last thing that's really changed is size. So resin 3D printers that were available originally a couple years ago for hobby level 3D printing were quite small. And although that's still primarily true, there's quite a few other resin printers that have come out that are larger, and there's even machines that have come out now that are bigger than some of what would be considered a big FDM printer. Now granted, a lot of those are still quite a bit more expensive than an FDM printer, but the bottom line is that the prices are getting less and less and the printers are getting bigger and better, which is awesome. And again, a combination of that and the variation of resins really makes it where you can use resin printing for a huge range of applications at this point.
Huge thank you to today's video sponsor, Loot Studios. They're an awesome studio providing high-quality miniatures in a $15 monthly subscription service. When you originally sign up, you'll receive a welcome pack which includes the hero models as well as tavern models, as well as this month's set of minis. This month's theme, called White Apocalypse, is all about the undead. It features 3 new hero models, 14 enemy models, as well as 14 terrain models. There's lore surrounding our heroes, as well as monthly painting guides to show you how to turn your prints into amazing pieces of art. Each model comes in a 32mm and 75mm variation with pre-hollowed and pre-supported options. All that's required of you is to download the models, drag them onto your build plate, hit slice, and fire up your printer. For anyone that's interested in printing minis or tabletop gaming, I highly recommend checking them out. Links will be down below in the description to where you can find out more.
Let's talk about the second reason why I was a little bit hesitant into getting into resin 3D printing, and that was the post-processing. As I previously mentioned, I am not a fan of post-processing. I've got a lot of respect for people that do the sanding and the priming and the painting and just anything else that goes into it. I think you're amazing, I love your work, but it is not something that I like to do regularly. To me, it's just very tedious, it's time consuming. I like to have my part coming off of my machine and being as close to finished as possible. So the idea of having to, remove heavy amounts of support and use IPA and then blast the part with UV was definitely a deterrent initially. Now, those steps that I mentioned still completely hold true, and to get a resin print off of the printer into a functional state, it still has to go through the cleaning and curing process. So what has changed though is the refinement of the process and the information and the tools out there to allow you to get across those points much smoother and much easier than you could before. With FDM printing, when I first got into it, supports were terrifying to me. Now granted, even fast forward 6 years, I don't like supports and I prefer not to use them if not needed, but I know that when the time comes and I need to use them, it's not that big of a deal. I've got my settings fairly dialed in for most materials. Well, with resin printing, I was under the impression that removing the supports, similar to a heavily supported FDM print, would be really tedious. And if you look at some of the resin prints that come off of those beds with all those crazy looking supports, like, it looks really terrifying. You see it and you're like, oh man, I don't want to have to remove those. Well, they actually are, in my opinion, much easier to remove than an FDM printer. And people have spent time dialing in the settings for those supports to where on a lot of the prints, I can actually just pull them off with my hand. And some users have discovered that if you actually put your part in warmish to lukewarm water, it even softens those supports more so to where you could really just pull them off. So support removal on most resin prints, if you've got your settings dialed in, is actually a cinch. Yes, it does take a bit of time, but still it separates from your part much, much easier than you would anticipate from initially looking at it. Second is cleaning the parts. You've got all sorts of loose, uncured resin on your part when it comes off of your printer, and if you've hollowed it, you've got loose resin inside of the part that can leak out for a really long time if you don't clean it correctly. And so originally I was taking a jar or a tupper of IPA, dropping the part in there and letting it sit, shaking it around, agitating it for 10 to 15 minutes and getting all sorts of just mixed results. Well, thanks to ultrasonic cleaners, as well as items like the Anycubic wash and cure station that I recently reviewed, this is no longer something you have to do. Basically, when I get done printing now, I take my part, I drop it into the Anycubic wash and cure station, I hit go, and 6 minutes later, I take the part out and it is completely clean. And better yet, thanks to Uncle Jesse's recommended alternatives for IPA, I've been using Mr. Clean, it's a cleaning agent, and it smells great, it's cheaper, it's much nicer to work with, and my parts have been turning out super clean. So I do not plan on going back to IPA, which is much nastier to work with and more expensive, and as of right now, in the last few months, much harder to come across. So again, just being able to drop the part in, hit go, let it do its thing, and come back, whether you've got a station like the Anycubic one or you're using an ultrasonic cleaner, it is awesome just being able to hit a timer, come back, and have your part consistently clean time and time again. Lastly is the curing aspect. So again, when I first got into Resin 3D printing, I had seen all these things saying, well, if you live somewhere sunny, just put the part in your windowsill or outside and it'll cure. Yes, that does work, but it gives you the most inconsistent results ever, depending on whether there's a cloud in the sky or how thick your part is or thin your part is. And so there is a lot of DIY solutions out there, from creating a little box with a UV light and a UV turntable to using a paint can, which I've used before, or they've got things again now like the Anycubic wash and cure station. But I will say that having some kind of a controlled environment that you can set a timer and know exactly how long your part has been in there for is going to be great. The reason why, again, I mentioned the Anycubic wash and cure station is you literally put the part in there, hit 6 minutes, it spins it around, and then it turns itself off, and so you take your part out. One of my gripes with a lot of the other DIY solutions, and there are solutions where you can set a timer that auto shuts it off as well, but if you forget your part in the cure station, it can totally over-cure the part. And so having something where it turns off the power after a certain amount of time is really, really nice in automating that post-processing workflow. So as you can see, the supports aren't as tedious as you would think they are. The cleaning aspect of it has become much more refined and simplified. And again, the UV blasting or the UV post-processing also is much easier thanks to some of the DIY or the now off-the-shelf items that you can purchase for this. Next up on my list is odors, and that's something that I had mentioned to you previously. Even with FDM printing, this is something that I had been concerned with when it came to things like ABS, and so certainly with resin, from what I had heard, I was very, very worried. And coming from now the other side, I can tell you that not all resins are created equal. I've had some resins that are very, very low odor, where you're standing about a foot away and you couldn't even tell that there was resin there or that resin was printing. And then I've used other resins where the whole place just stinks like some kind of funky chemical. That's the only way I can describe it, is just a kind of nasty, foreign, funky smell. Now, with that being said, I do think that if you have the option to have your resin printer in a garage, in a spare room, not in a place where it's confined and you're gonna be stuck with it for long periods of time, I certainly think that's a better idea. But for myself, I've been in an apartment the last 3 years and I just haven't had a designated space for it. So for me, being able to use and know which resins are high odor or low odor has been great. And my fiance's got a very good nose, and for those times where I did use a resin that was a bit stinkier, she let me know. And I definitely don't want to be breathing anything bad in. I don't want her breathing bad things in. I don't want my pets breathing bad things in. So again, I will say, if you can put it somewhere that's well ventilated, definitely do that. But if you get a resin for the first time starting off and you think it smells really bad, don't rule off all resins, because again, some smell bad, some smell like nothing at all. So the odor is definitely not as bad as people describe, as long as you're using resins that don't have a really strong odor. Next on this list is price. As always, I am trying to get the best bang for my buck, as many of you guys are. This is basically a hobby for me, and so I need to have machines and access to technology that's not going to break the bank, and I always want to test and review things that many people are going to be able to afford, hopefully, and have access to. And so price of resin was something that was very concerning to me. Looking back a year and a half to 2 years ago, you'd be hard pressed to find a bottle of resin that was under $60 or $70, which to me is like liquid gold, especially when you compare that to the $20 spool of filament that I was normally picking up for my standard FDM print jobs. And so fast forward now, thanks to companies like Soraya Tech and Anycubic and Elegoo, you can find a bottle or a liter of resin for $30-ish, sometimes a little bit more, and sometimes on a super sale, sometimes a little bit less. And so now I don't have to feel so bad when I'm printing something out because it's a lot more affordable. You can basically print twice as much for the same amount as what you could print, again, 2 years ago. So that's huge. On top of that, resin printers have come down in cost substantially. So 2 years ago, if you found a resin printer for around $400, that was a great deal. And I mean, I still think that that is a great deal compared to what they went for prior to that, but nowadays, it's not uncommon that you can find a machine like the Elegoo Mars or the Anycubic Photon Zero or a number of other ones I've reviewed on this channel for right around the $200-ish price tag. And so that price of the machine associated with the lower price point of the resin has really lowered that barrier of entry, which is fantastic for, again, anybody that's looking to get into this, even if it isn't for work or a small business that they're trying to start and just for fun. You know, there's a lot less initial cost that goes into it to get up and running with your station, which is fantastic. The technology is great. Now, the last thing on this list is software, and that is a huge deal. I don't care whether you've got the best machine in the world that can print beautifully. If the software sucks, your experience is going to be rough and you're not going to get good results. The software is what takes that STL file, chops it up into image files, and allows you to print out with various supports and cure times and burn-in times and hollowness and holes and things of that nature. And even 2 years ago or a year and a half, around the time I got into Resin 3D printing, the software was still pretty rough. It was getting better, but prior to that, it was a lot of bouncing around different softwares to accomplish things. So you maybe use 2 or 3 different softwares just to get your file hollowed, supports generated, then back into the slicing software. And thankfully, with the release of ChitTubeBox, which I don't know how long it's been out for now, but close to the time I got into Resin 3D printing was when it started up and coming. So probably a year to a year and a half ago. Well, ChitTubeBox is an awesome slicer, and I would say it's the closest thing that we've got as far as a fairly stable and reliable piece of software that has a ton of functionality, and it also can be simple if you want it to be simple, or complex if you want to get into the kind of weeds with it. But the cool thing about ChitTubeBox is it's compatible with a huge list of resin printers. So you choose your resin printer, do all of your hollowing, supports, and slicing, and export it. And if for some reason your printer is not on that list, well, the good news is you can still hollow it and generate supports, and then just output it to your slicing software to then slice up for your printer. But ChitTubeBox has been amazing, and I think that having one piece of software versus having to bounce in multiples just really lowers that learning curve. And also, because so many people are now just using ChitTubeBox, there's a lot more content on it available. There's a lot more YouTube tutorials, there's a lot more forum posts, there's just a lot more data, which is nice because if you have a question on the software, chances are somebody else has also had that question, and because so many people are widely using it, it's a lot easier to find answers to those questions. So having good software is a must, and again, I think ChitTubeBox has done all, at least LCD-based resin printers, a huge service. Now let's talk about accessories as well as just some things on consumables. So one accessory that I use all the time is my Wham Bam slap mat, which is my bright orange silicone mat that I got in from Wham Bam. It is awesome, really because it's made of silicone and resin does not stick to it very well. Prior to this, I was using a kind of almost like a food tray underneath my resin printer, which worked well for catching the resin, but cleaning it was another story. The resin would really stick down hard to it, and I had a difficult time removing a lot of the old cured or uncured resin that was around there. Well, with the silicone, it's much easier to just wipe it up, and the cool thing with it is you can actually take the silicone mat outside if you spilled some resin and let the sunlight cure it, and then just kind of peel it off to dispose of it. So the slap mat's been awesome. I keep all of my tools on it, and I keep it beside my printer, again, in case there's any spilling. It's an awesome thing to have. Now, the next thing on my list is the Anycubic Wash and Cure Station. I reviewed this just recently, so if you want to see the full video on that, links will be down below in the description. But this thing it has been the biggest game changer for my overall workflow. I do my normal resin printing, nothing's changed there, but my drop the part in and hit go, and 6 minutes later it's clean, and then take it out, put it on the little turntable, hit go, and 6 minutes later it's cured is insane. I love the wash and cure station. If you haven't seen my video on it, you need to check it out. It's seriously, I said in that video that it might be something that from the distance you don't really know if you need it, but I'm telling you after having it that you need it. Like, you don't think that you do, but it's really going to simplify your workflow. And if you're doing any sort of volume and resin printing, seriously, it is such an awesome accessory. So the last kind of different accessory, which a lot of people do use some variation of, is just a funnel. Now, this funnel, I wish I remembered who recommended it. It was someone on Twitter a long time ago, and it's basically a pretty big funnel from AutoZone that's got a wire screen in it and a tube on the end of it. And so if I'm ever transferring resin back into a bottle, I always use that because you can pour the resin into it and it'll seep through the wire screen. The wire screen will catch any particles or cured resin that might be floating around in your vat, so that way it doesn't go back in the bottle, which, you know, having cured resin go back into your vat could damage your LCD screen if the build plate pushes it into your LCD screen. So this funnel is absolutely amazing. If I can find a link to it, I will place links down below in the description, because I've seen a lot of different types and I know that some of the other funnels work quite well, but I'm telling you that this funnel is awesome. It's a great funnel. Okay, now let's talk about consumables. You are going to go through a ridiculous amount of gloves. You need to stock up on nitrile gloves. You need to stock up on paper towels. You need to stock up on some kind of cleaning solution, whether it's IPA or, again, if you're using a ultrasonic cleaner or the Anycubic cure station like Mean Green or Mr. Clean, but you need a lot of cleaning solution. All it takes is one spill of your resin when you're knocking it over, or you're trying to pour stuff back in and it goes everywhere, and you will go through a ton of paper towels. And there is nothing worse than realizing that you ran out of paper towels. So I keep a massive roll of paper towels in my area at all times, just in case there's an emergency. But seriously, you're gonna want a lot. And when it comes to the gloves, I wish there was a better way to go about it, but you just need a lot of gloves. Every time you take a part off and transfer it over, you should be wearing gloves. You do not want to get resin on your hands. If you get it on your hands and you don't wash it off quickly and it starts to cure, you can get some really nasty burns on your skin. So please, please, please practice safety, use gloves, buy a ton of gloves when you're able to find them. Of course, aside from that, you will need a couple bottles of resin. This is going to heavily depend on what resin printer you have. If you've got a Elegoo Mars, you can probably make a bottle, or at least two 500 milliliter bottles last you a long time. If you've got a big machine like the Peopoly Phenom, then you are going to run through a ton of resin very, very quickly. So you will probably want 4 to 6 to start off with as a minimum almost. So yes, you will go through resin probably much quicker than you think. If you're just getting into resin printing, you're gonna wanna print out all sorts of cool things, and sure, you can hollow things out, but still, have a few bottles on hand always. Aside from that, you've got some consumables. FEP is going to be a consumable for just about every resin printer. That's about, not all, but most are using that as your in between the LCD screen and your actual liquid resin. And so those will need to be replaced. I always recommend having like 2 on hand just in case you're replacing it and you're tightening the screws and something slips and you damage the FEP. I'm not saying that's happened to me, of course, but if it does, it totally has happened to me. But having some of those sheets, they're really cheap and you should just have some. Also, the LCD screen on MSLA printers is considered a consumable, so having one on hand is also a good idea. Hopefully the printer that you have is one that's popular enough that the manufacturer will continue making LCD screens for a long enough time, but still, even if they do have them when you want to buy them, it's not super uncommon for them to take a few days to get to you, or maybe they're back ordered. So just having a LCD screen, a spare one on hand, is great for minimizing downtime. Okay, so lastly, we're gonna go through just some random tips or tricks or things that I may be obvious, maybe they're not obvious, but I can guarantee you if they weren't obvious or you think about these things, they will save you from some failed prints. So the first one is always have more than enough resin in the vat. I cannot tell you how many times when I got into resin printing, I tried eyeballing it and thinking like, okay, this looks like it's just enough resin, or I would try to get it as close as possible to having enough resin. Well, there is nothing worse than starting a resin print, seeing it looking beautiful, going to bed and waking up to the last chunk of it just not complete because there wasn't enough resin. It dried up in the vat. So I always say have plenty of resin. It's much easier to pour the resin back into the bottle or back into your container versus losing the print. You can't do anything about it once it's done. I mean, you could maybe try to figure out what layer it stopped at and print it and put it on top like you would do with some people do with FDM printers, but it is less than ideal and going to be a total pain. So yes, always have more than enough resin in your vat. Just end of chat. Also, supports are your friend with resin printing. Like I had mentioned previously, with FDM, I always try to avoid them. Unless I need them, then I will use them. With resin printing, the more the merrier. Seriously, if you don't have enough supports, then I've seen instances where best case scenario, a part of the model just will kind of sag, but worst case scenario, which happens more often than not if you don't have enough supports, is the entire model falls off of your build plate into the vat and you get a mess, you lose your print, you waste resin. So supports are your friend. Screw around with the settings enough to where you've got a good base set of supports in Chitubox or whatever slicer you're using. I recommend Chitubox, but there's also some really great YouTube videos and articles out there on recommended default Chitubox settings. I typically go with heavy supports, even for things that might not need it, because again, with the correct settings and the correct use of warm water or however you finagle the supports off, it's not bad removing the support, and it is a lot worse losing your print. And trust me, it'll happen to you once or twice and you'll think to yourself like, why didn't I use heavier supports? And hopefully you'll listen to me and that won't happen to you. One more tip that I have is always test out new resin. I don't care whether you've printed with, Elegoo Standard White and you're trying out Elegoo Standard Black or a translucent or a tough or whatever, or you found maybe some settings online that you think will work. That's great, and I hope they do work for you. But if they don't, it's gonna suck. And so there's a lot of things that can affect resin, from your machine to your temperature to color to all sorts of different properties associated with it. And even if you've got the exact same resin, having a different color, or whether it's translucent or what I've learned recently, if it's black, might require completely different cure times. And so just because you've had good luck with a red resin and you're gonna try a black resin, don't just go big with it. I mean, you can, but I'm just telling you right now that I have learned when I saw parts not sticking or falling off that it required an extra couple seconds of cure time per layer in order to have the part at the same hardness as a different color. So again, just when you're getting a new resin that you haven't tried before in your current setup, do something small to make sure that you're getting good plate adhesion and that the layers are turning out correctly before doing something big. Trust me, you'll thank me for this. So those are just a couple of tips that I think are useful. I've got quite a few more, but this video is probably very long at this point, and I really just wanted to share some info with new users or people considering getting into resin printing that will help you get up and running, help you make your decision, and hopefully allow you to skip some steps and save you some prints is also one of the big goals. I know that a lot of people on my channel also have resin printers and have been printing for some time, so let me know in the comments down below if you've got one tip or one trick that you think is incredibly useful that could help other people either wanting to get into resin printing or just starting off in resin printing, that if you had known this, you would have been much more successful from the beginning. And also, if you've got any other questions about Resin 3D printing, about anything I talked about, or just questions in general, let me know in the comments down below. If I get enough questions, I might end up making a different, similar type of informational video on resin printing. But yeah, let me know in the comments down below. Don't forget to smack the like button, and if you're not subscribed for more great videos, I make a video every single Saturday. I haven't missed a single Saturday this year, which is insane. I've just been going at it. I've been really enjoying it. And if you want to support the channel more so, links will be down below to my Patreon. There's some super cool rewards, and it means a ton to me. It allows me to spend more time doing what I love, which is making content for you guys. On that note, this has been Daniel from ModBot. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I will see you guys in my next video. Peace, guys.